when Poe was on his deathbed, delirious, probably drunk, or maybe very ill, probably a combination of the two. When he was on his deathbed, he called out the name Reynolds more than once. Now, we don't know exactly what he meant by this, but there's a good possibility that he was referring to a famous explorer of his time, Jeremiah Reynolds. Jeremiah Reynolds was very interested in the South Pole, very interested in what we call the Antarctic. And he had written about some of his travels in southern seas, mainly in relation to the whaling trade. And Reynolds was trying during Poe's lifetime to raise enough money for an expedition to sail all the way to the South Pole. During Poe's time, the South Pole had not yet been reached. Captain James Cook in the 1770s was able to penetrate the Antarctic Circle, but he was so overwhelmed with ice that he could go no further once he crossed the circle and didn't make the pole. Poe was fascinated by travel literature. In particular, he was interested in literature about travel to the Arctic and the Antarctic, travel toward the North Pole, travel toward the South Pole. In the 1820s, there was a former military captain from St. Louis named John Cleves Sims. John Cleves Sims. And Sims wrote a book in which he speculated that at the North Pole and the South Pole there are holes that lead down to the center of a hollow earth. The idea being that when one reached the South Pole, one would see a huge vortex, and that vortex could suck your ship into it, and you would find yourself in a hollow earth and possibly floating along on a subterranean river that would eventually take you out on the other side in the vortex at the North Pole. Now, obviously, we know this is not true, but in Poe's time, it was a theory that could not be entirely discounted because people had not yet sailed to the poles. Poe loved this idea, and it shows up in his novel, the only novel he wrote, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, kind of rhymes with John Cleves Sims, in which the protagonist, one Arthur Gordon Pym, at the very end finds himself in a boat heading toward the South Pole. And when he reaches the South Pole, indeed, there is a huge whirlpool, and it starts whirling him down, down, down to its center. And just as that happens, a huge white figure rises up above him. And then the novel ends, almost as if Pym has gone to a place where language cannot go. He has moved beyond the world of maps, moved beyond the known world into a world for which there is no map, no language. So the novel appropriately stops there. Of course, within the fictional world of the novel, Pym somehow survives this plunge and writes the book, part of the book. We see this similarly in the short story Manuscript Found in a Bottle, where the nameless protagonist finds himself on this old ship, and the ship is making itself southward, making its way southward. And much like Pym, when the narrator reaches the very end of the known world, as he plunges into the South Polar vortex, he stops writing because he finds a place where language cannot go. The story ends in this way. Horror upon horror, the ice opens suddenly to the right and to the left, and we're whirling dizzily in immense concentric circles round and round the borders of a gigantic amphitheater, the summit of whose walls is lost in the darkness and the distance. But little time will be left me to ponder upon my destiny. The circles rapidly grow small. We are plunging madly within the grasp of the whirlpool, and amid a roaring and bellowing and thundering of ocean and of tempest, the ship is quivering, O God, and going down. And then the narrative stops. Now, I'm bringing up this context of the theory of the hollow earth that can be accessed through the holes at the poles, uh, because it is an interesting context for thinking about MS Found in the Bottle and, of course, PIM, which we're not reading for this particular class. But also, it's one version of an ending fairly typical of a Poe short story. And that is a moment when the known world rather apocalyptically fades away, when the world of comfort and enclosure, the recognizable world, is violently destroyed or transcended. So we see that in the end of MS Found in the Bottle. We also see it at the end of William Wilson, where the protagonist ends up killing himself. So that story ends with a character passing from life into that unknown country, death. We see it in The Fall of the House of Usher. At the end of that story, just as Roderick goes mad, Roderick Usher, the subject of the story, and just as the narrator himself, another nameless narrator, seems to go mad as well, the very house collapses and disappears. And we see the narrator running away, bewildered, befuddled. He has seen things that he's never seen before that he cannot understand. At the end of Ligeia, we see a dead woman suddenly come back to life, again, pushing the narrator into a world that goes beyond traditional understanding. So, why is Poe so interested in this, in these violent, these apocalyptic openings into terra incognita? Well, Poe is very interested in experiences that we can't name, emotional experiences of fear, terror, nervousness, anxiety, obsession. Um, and for Poe, these very unsettling moments, often caused by trauma or the disorientations of dream or reverie, or perhaps the befuddlements of opium use, these are examples of what we can call the Gothic Sublime. Now, we've seen in Emerson, his essay Nature in particular, a kind of transcendentalist sublime, meaning Emerson, say, in his moment where he becomes a transparent eyeball, and when he becomes nothing and sees all, he goes from feeling finite and enclosed on a common, the bare common, to feeling infinite. He opens up to a kind of infinite expanse. And that's what the sublime is. Remember, it's an experience that is overwhelming in its boundlessness, in its force. And on the one hand, we feel a sense of failure because our minds cannot find a concept or an image to understand this power, this space. But even as we feel overwhelmed, we also feel exhilarated, elevated, because we are partake of this power. We are part of this space. That's a kind of transcendental sublime where we go from finite to infinite, from bounded to boundlessness with ecstasy. For Poe, the sublime is brought about not through a kind of naturally induced ecstasy, but again through a kind of trauma, a disorientation. But through this trauma and disorientation, we are pushed into experiences that we don't have names for, that we don't have concepts for. And this is painful, but it can also open us up to new possibilities. To go into the hole at the pole, you may have your traditional ego annihilated, but who knows what sort of wonders you'll experience. To pass from life to death, the same. To move out of a house, the House of Usher, that is consumed by claustrophobia and sickness. Painful transition from that into this wide open expanse with the house shattering down behind you, but again, a kind of opening to something else. So I want us to think about these moments in Poe where there is a passing from known to unknown through some sort of violent, confusing experience. And on the surface, these experiences would seem to be quite negative, but perhaps, and this is what I really want you to think about, are there potential moments of transcendence or knowledge, even if the knowledge can't be quite articulated, and even if the transcendence can't quite be named.